I'm David Betancourt. I spend a lot of time in a Gilded Age mansion. The house is called Belcourt. It's off the famous Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. Built for a divorced bachelor in 1895, it has been recently restored and has a fascinating history. A quick recap of our last episode in which Harle told us a great story about how, as a 19-year-old woman with aspirations to be a doctor, she met a tall drink of water named Harle Tinney. They fell in love, and he proposed nearly instantly, giving Harle a big decision to make. Would she continue on her path that her parents chose for her, or would she follow the path of Harle Tinney and what he wanted to do in his family's estate, Belcourt Castle? And now I want to ask you, what was this house like when you first moved in?
I remember the first night coming into the castle as Mrs. Harle Tinney. Now, I no longer was in the guest room. I was in Donald's bedroom, which was the big room that overlooked the Almy Pond sunset room, I called it. And we had a Chinese bed. It was huge. I still have that bed. Haven't got to put back together again, but it creaked.
Oh my goodness, Harle.
Well, I thought everybody else could hear the creaks.
But you just made our podcast PG-13 and made me blush all in one big swoop.
Well, anyway, we enjoyed the night, and we just sort of were happy to sleep because I had been up very early that morning, December 2nd. And we had an adventure. And by the time we got to bed, there was no television or anything at that point in time. Even though people had televisions, we had one, but we didn't ever watch it. There wasn't much on in those days.
They were already calling Belcourt Castle at that point?
No, it was still Belcourt.
It was just
Belcourt.
When did Castle come about then?
That was maybe a couple of years after we were married. I was going to say about 1962, maybe. And we had been married only a month and a half when we bought the stained glass business up in Providence. And the Tinneys were constantly restoring the house. I mean, every day was a big project. And of all the people that understands that, you do,
yes.
David. I mean, there was no end to the projects, everything. But this house had been updated by the Tinneys as much as possible. But we had water issues. We had electrical issues. I mean, we only had a 200 amp service for the whole house. And we kept adding things like coffee makers and refrigerators and modern appliances that would blow the main fuses.
What was the main, like, this part of the house like then? So they lived on the other side of the house. Was it common for you just to be on that side during your days?
It was too cold over here.
So you only kind of visited this side, or when there were tours?
We didn't do tours in the winter. We only were open in those early years during the warm weather. Actually, the Tinneys extended the Newport season. The Newport season was 4th of July to September, the Labor Day. The Tinneys extended it and started on Memorial Day, and we were open Memorial Day to the 1st of October.
Well, that makes sense. That Memorial Day to October makes sense here, but I think it's even earlier now. I would think it's probably May 1.
Well, the Tinneys extended the hours after I got married, little by little. But those first few years, we were in the stained glass business in the wintertime, and we closed the stained glass business during July and August. We had to hire tour guides. But in the early years, the family and Benny Colleen were the only tour guides.
I always wonder how much we should talk about Benny right now, or if we should just do a whole episode on Benny.
Absolutely.
Because I think the idea that really quickly in 1955, the Lorillard show up and Benny's here, and he's like, "Hey guys," and they are like cool with it, and then they leave, and the Tinneys show up, and they're like, and Benny's still in the house, and he convinces them to let him stay.
Donald and Benny got along very well because of the Nicolas Poussin paintings that we had. And Benny was, an art expert, really, and an artist. And he was living up in the musician's balcony or the organ loft at the time.
Really? So before you got that organ, what was that? That organ loft was more open, right? It was more space.
And it was just a plain room. And we have the pictures in the newspaper of Benny in there with one of his paintings. And he lived up there. But he had a kerosene heater, which made it partially livable. However, after we were open more and whatever, we said, Benny, you really need to move into a more habitable place because there's no water up there. There's no heat up there. There was no electricity up there.
It was wild.
I mean,
it's like having a feral animal in the house, but he's the painter that lives up there. Like you lived on the other side of the house and you just came into this room and be like, oh, hey, that's the guy that lives up there.
Well, the reason that he got his job was because this room has a high ceiling and he was painting the mural for Gloria Dei. But
transformation, right? Transfiguration.
And
I think it's called.
But he could only paint in this room in the warmer weather. He couldn't paint in the winter anyway, but he had a lot of friends. And he was friends with all of the caretakers of the mansions. That's why he changed his name to an Irish name, because he wasn't Irish, he was Danish. And
I didn't even realize that.
Well,
what's his Danish name?
His Danish name was Cohn, C-O-H-N.
Oh.
And fantastic.
Was he Jewish?
He was Jewish.
Yeah.
But he was never bar mitzvahed because his mother was a Lutheran.
Oy vey. Well, we have to do an episode. Did he ever paint something just for you? Like, did you?
Yes, he
were you guys sitting around one night,
and you still have them. I think the portraits of Alva and Oliver that he.
I don't want to talk about those things. Actually, they're not here anymore.
Those were the
Might
ones.
be they were. I think they were sold from Aardvark.
Those were the ones that Benny painted for and gave it to the Tinney family as an opening.
There was like a picture of the Oliver picture. Actually, wasn't Oliver. It was Perry.
No, it was Oliver Belmont. Those were pictures of Oliver Belmont and Perry Belmont based on the Belmont family who actually showed Benny original pictures.
Wow.
Remember, they were alive then.
That's right.
They were alive. Newport was dead, but the Belmonts were alive. Mrs. August Belmont, I was not here. It was just before Donnie and I got married that Mrs. August Belmont visited Belcourt, came up with her limousine and her chauffeur.
Yeah.
And they came in. She came in the front door, and I believe it was in one of the months when they weren't open. It was in the winter time, but not real winter. It might have been November or October. But anyway, the Tinneys were installing a potbelly stove so they could do work in the Grand Hall. And she was saying, you don't expect to heat Belcourt with that, do you? And they said, no, but if we can heat this little bit of place so we can clean the floors and repair the damask and do the repair work in the Grand Hall when we're not open. But when I first came here, we were doing Christmas decorations and we were planning the Christmas dinner in the family dining room or in the oval dining room for our family.
How many would be invited to that?
Well, there was probably only about 10. But
So
I mean,
Tinney's was a small family. But you
well,
had a lot of other people who lived here too, though, it seemed.
well, not at that point in time.
Oh.
In fact, Benny was gone. Benny would leave somewhere around November and go back to Denmark and spend the winters in Denmark.
Oh, that's cool.
And so he wasn't here. When he came back in April and he found Donnie was married, although Benny and I had worked as tour guides together that summer before we were married,
Benny was upset?
sort of. Benny called Donald the old master. And they would have a fun time after, before dinner, usually around 5 or 6 o'clock when the tours were over, etc. And they would talk about art. And Donald learned a lot from Benny. And I learned a lot from Donald.
Huh.
And I learned everything I know about art from Donald because history was my worst subject in school. I was lucky that I could get a B in history. and not anything that I really enjoyed.
Look what happens. You become like a historian of Newport.
Living here and talking with people and learning from Donald and beginning to appreciate the workmanship, which is finally being discovered by the people who thought the owners were the most important people. But Donald always said, no, it's not the owner. Oliver Belmont owned the house, but it's the craftsman who did the work that I want to aggrandize. And so that's when we gave our tours, it was all about the plaster work, the flooring, the beautiful carving in the cabinets, and the collections. For Donald, the collection was his most important thing. And what he did was to save pieces from the estates that were being torn down. 37 Newport mansions we had collections from. And that's where most of our time was spent, was restoring the antiques.
So actually, let's talk about that for a second. So you're talking about a time in Newport where the mansions now have become, like, Newport doesn't really know what to do with these buildings. The owners have abandoned them. So that's when preservation comes about, right?
Well, preservation
60s.
came in 1947 thanks to George Hull.
Okay.
George Hull, who was an officer in the First World War and had been in the trenches, literally in France, survived. And when I went to tea there before we were married, and as well after we were married, George and Daisy Hull were the only people in the summer colony that were really friendly to the Tinney family.
Huh.
Most of the old widows, and now I can tell you because I'm in my 80s now and I understand the way people think when you're in your 80s. It's different from when you're 19, believe me. But George Hull was in his middle 80s, and his wife, who was totally blind, the granddaughter of General Pearson, she was nearly 90. I think she was 87 or 88. Now, to me, as a 19-year-old, they were old, however, very active. And George had tea every afternoon at 4 o'clock, and he had all of his friends that were in the summer colony come to the tea. The people that I met there were mostly all octogenarians, and also I understand that today because many of my friends are octogenarians, older than I am. I have one wonderful lady who's 90, and my cousins are all in my generation, are all up there in age. We think differently at this point in time. I think differently at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember my first night as a young girl being married and coming into this beautiful place. But everything that Donald and I talked about was art and antiques and architecture, which he knew off the bat. I mean, he never had to even think about anything. He knew the designs inside and out and the history of things, the royal families of Europe. He just knew it, and I had to learn it. I'll never forget when I took the first tour, they had no notes for tour guides. They had no book to go through. So I wrote everything down. And did I know any European history? No, we were never really taught European history in school. Ancient history, yes, but not the French history. We learned about the wars, names, dates, and battles, and that's all we learned about.
Right.
But we didn't learn about the art. And Donald knew everything about the art because he was well educated. But Benny could share with him living in Europe, in Paris and in Denmark and in France and in all over Europe, Italy.
What was Donald's favorite spot in the house?
The ballroom.
Yeah, where we are right now.
Right, exactly. The Tinneys never would have bought this house if it weren't for the ballroom because it was in horrible shape. Even when I got married, the south wing was stinky. And the pigeons who lived in the clock tower, because the windows were broken up there, I saw them, the heads of the pigeons and the goop and all of that the Tinneys had not cleaned. They put most of their effort in the north wing rather than in the south wing at that time, except for the habitable area. And even the room that we were in, Donald had put in that Louis XIV mantle by himself. They bought it up in Providence, and he said, I want this to look nice. But we didn't have...
That's the one in the dining room?
It wasn't... I mean, we had a bathroom that was 19th century at best, and we had the best bathtub. I have to say that claw ball bathtub was 6 feet long, and it was luxurious. And the porcelain sink, which was in there, and it worked. Everything that they had plumbers come in and make it work. So we did have a nice bathroom.
Plumbers.
But
I said, the plumbers.
Thank you. Well,
thank you to most of the plumbers.
I think D. Dixon Donovan was the plumbing company, which was...
There's one plumber we have to talk about at some point, but not today.
That will come towards after Ruth Tinney died. And in fact, the book that I'm writing now on Ruth Tinney ends in 1995. And my end sentence is that the aftermath will be told in my autobiography. She was dead. And what was done, and a friend of mine, I let him read the Ruth Tinney book, and he said, well, you have to take Newport's socialite out of that. Ruth was not a socialite. I disagree in some ways that she was a socialite in the early days, but as soon as we got married, everything changed. Then we were workmen.
Did she like you? Did she like you?
Yeah.
Did you like her?
She liked me because Donald loved me.
Yeah.
I mean, she loved Donald.
What did she call you? Just Harley?
Harley.
Yeah.
Well, and until fairly recently, within the last few years, I always wanted to be referred to as Harley, not Mrs. Tinney. Because she was Mrs. Tinney. And
interesting. But you are Mrs. Tinney too.
Well, I was, but I was never recognized or even thought of as Mrs. Tinney. I was Harley.
Yeah.
And
what did she call her son?
Donnie.
Yeah. What was Harold like? Was Harold... I envisioned Harold as more like stoic and kind of quiet and reserved, but like stern at times. I don't know why, but
Harle Tinney was what I call the salt of the earth and very wise.
Huh.
He was a man of few words, but when he said something, it had power. He was a superb craftsman, and he could do anything. I mean, he had started out as a boy when he was 9 working in a wood turning shop. He had built wagons. He had worked with his grandfather, who was a blacksmith.
Wow. Did he do a lot of work here?
Oh, absolutely. But quietly. But he knew all about wood. I don't think there's an expert in the world that knew as much or even knows today as much about wood as Harle Tinney did.
Is there a part of the house that he fixed up that
the
still
family worked
resides
together?
Today?
And
okay. They all just kind of pitched in?
Yeah, and actually a lot of the furniture that was in their family dining room in the South Wing was furniture that he had built during the 1940s.
Wow.
He knew everything. He knew how to take care of wood. He knew how to repair it. He knew how to carve it. He knew how to, I mean, he was an expert at wood turning because that was when he was 9 years old. He worked in a wood turning shop in Charlemont. And he was a natural engineer.
Oh, cool.
And he taught Donald. One of the things that the Tinneys acquired from the city of Newport was the, Paul Miller calls it the Humane Society fountain that used to be in Washington Square. And the city dumped it in the quarry. And I have the picture of Ruth Tinney in the quarry next to that stuff. And the city manager said, you know, it's a shame to have all that beautiful granite in the quarry. Why don't we give it to Belcourt? So they brought the city trucks and they dumped it on the front lawn. Well, the bowl for that fountain was 6,000 pounds. You take one end, I'll take the other. Yeah, right.
Goodness.
But it was an engineering feat to install that in the middle of the courtyard. But my father-in-law was the engineer and figured it out that we...
Where did it go?
Aardvark has it. Long story. That comes after. That's the end of my life.
The courtyard during the Tinneys' ownership of the house is the coolest courtyard. I think.
When they first bought Belcourt,
it was empty, I imagine.
It had 4-foot hay, and Benny used to go and enjoy natural in the middle of the courtyard because the entrance to the courtyard was boarded up. Yeah. You couldn't get into it, and the only way you could get in was from the inside, and go through the library doors.
So when the Tinneys first arrive, they opened that courtyard where those white gates are that we come in today.
Yes.
That was
after we got married. We put those in. And in fact, that was one of the exciting things that we constantly did was to monitor the buildings that were being torn down. Donnie took me into the reef before it burned when we were first married. And it was pretty much open to the world.
You could just walk in?
You could just walk in.
Wild.
And a lot of people don't know that we saved Seafair from being burned down. Mr. Blake, who owned it, lived in Texas. He had plenty of money, but he wasn't interested in what his aunt had left him in Newport, so he was just going to sell it for $125,000. And we put an offer in on it, and we had the purchase and sale all done. But when he came to sign all the papers, which he had to do in person, we didn't have DocuSign in those days.
Right on.
So he had to come to Newport. And when he saw the house, he said, I'm not selling this for that money.
Oh,
14 acres of oceanfront. But the house was falling down. The 38 hurricane had done a lot of damage to it. And there were very few people who wanted to restore something that was that far gone, where the ceiling in the main room was on the floor and the crystal chandelier underneath it and whatever. And
is anything from Seafair here?
Probably, but can I remember what? I remember going in there. I know we built the original gates so that people couldn't just walk up there. We secured the place without any remuneration, but the studio was still active in the summertime, but the main house was falling apart. But Mr. Blake finally sold it, and now Jay Leno owns it. But I could tell him history of Seafair, having seen it in 1961, maybe.
Mr. Leno was a guest of ours. Well, that's not actually that true. He actually didn't come here, but we went to him. So the Bugatti crew came here, and then they were like, we're going to go take a ride. Do you want to come? So I said, yes. So I got in the first car, and we all drove to Seafair. And then the guy was like, get out, push that button. So I pushed the button. I didn't know Jay Leno lived there. I had forgotten that. It didn't even dawn on me. So I pushed the button, and I'm like, hello? We're from the Bugatti Club. We're here. And Jay Leno's voice comes over the thing. He's like, hey, guys, come on. And then he was like waving at the top of the... But he didn't let me in. He wouldn't let us into the house. We could only hang outside.
I think it's Reedy's who owned the house at the time. They did the restoration. I mean, let me tell you, they really restored that house from top to bottom and made it habitable.
That is right on the ocean. I mean, it's like in the ocean almost.
Well, yes, but during the 38 hurricane, 2 of their servants died, and that was not happy for them. But the 38 hurricane did more damage to Newport than anything else. I mean, that was when Mrs. James Duke walled herself up in the second floor closet because the water jumped the water jumped the first floor at Rough Point because they're on, and came into the second floor. But the house was so well built that it didn't leak down. Whereas Seafair, the water came in right through the main doors and broke all the glass, etc. And it was still broken in 1960, 61 or 62 when we went through there and wanted to save it. Donnie wanted to save it, but there was no furniture left in it, and the chandelier that had been in their main room was actually under the rubble of plaster that had fallen. Because after the 38 hurricane, the plasterers replastered it, but didn't take the old plaster off. So the nails that held the old plaster rusted and let go in the 54 hurricane.
What a mess.
I was young, but I was there. Anyway, that goes back to who I am. My world of Belcourt was now my world. And I put all my love into the house, into Donald, and into making this successful. And it wasn't easy.
Well, thank you, Harle.
Well, thank you, David, for inviting me
back
home.
Yeah, of course. Anytime. All right. We'll see you next time.